And let me go ahead and bring up the course continuation with what we were doing before. Of course, we've already covered the scientific revolution already. We've covered most of the Age of Enlightenment, like a lot of the major proponents of the Age of Enlightenment, which is usually what I talk about. I am going to kind of spend a little time talking about also, I can't remember if we talked about, did I talk about Adam Smith? I couldn't remember if I did or not. If I did Adam Smith, I forgot what the last thing I did was from the last lecture. Hold on a second here. But I don't think I did Adam Smith as far as I know. I can go ahead and quickly do him, and then I'll continue talking about, let me first talk about John Locke first, and I'll do him last as what I'll do. Well, actually, I can kind of pull it up real quick if you want for Adam Smith, because I don't think I've got that one. Let me see. Hold on. Let me get it for you real quick. Yeah, there he is. So yeah, Adam Smith. I don't think we've covered him yet, but Smith was the father of capitalism or free enterprise, and he's kind of an important figure if you think about with the Age of Enlightenment. He's a Scottish, I guess they could say British if you want to say that, but born in Scotland originally. He went to several schools in Scotland. He's college educated, University of Edinburgh, and then, of course, University of Glasgow. Smith's kind of important because he's kind of seen as the father of free trade or free enterprise, of course, later referred to as like capitalism down the line. And he wasn't the first person to really kind of come up with the idea of, free trade. Like there's these French economists that were in France that went back to the time of, I want to say back to Colbert and all of that in France. They were called French physiocrats. He was heavily influenced by their ideas. The French physiocrats had this idea called laissez-faire, where they believed that the government, like in France, whatever, shouldn't over-regulate, the economy and all that, and kind of let it do or let it be, leave it alone. I think there's some translations of it. And that was something that, in the British Empire, they were doing the opposite. It was more regulated. And, of course, it helped cause the American Revolution, later and all that. And so that was something Smith came up with. And he wrote a book, of course, about it, of course, The Wealth of Nations, which became very, very famous. A lot of people believe The Wealth of Nations was really the first major modern economic treatise that really led to like the rise of capitalism, which would take a while to take off, like in the 1800s. But he was one of the first major proponent of it, to push free trade, allow countries to trade with each other freely and not over-regulate and stuff like that. In The Wealth of Nations, he had this ideas he came up with that were like the keys. He thought the free trade and capitalism. He called them the three natural laws of economics. You may have heard of that before. And those are the three, of course, which are very famous, which is, of course, the law of self-interest. People are in business to make money primarily. Law of competition. Smith believed that competition would create better business and create better products overall. Then a third one, of course, the law of supply and demand. He believed that supply dictated demand and vice versa. And so there's too much of something, it changes the price, versus something that's, too little. So things like that are very interesting later, because it has effect not just on economies, but even causing revolutions. Like in France, there was a lack of food, and actually ended up causing like the French Revolution, like one of the causes anyway, that actually happened. So then, of course, let me quickly also talk about John Locke as well. He's kind of also considered one of the early philosophers. He kind of goes back to like the late 1600s, early 1700s. English philosopher Locke was also seen as like a political theorist, which, he influenced a lot of countries, like the Americans, the French, and so on, to kind of develop better, governmental ideas. He's famous for a series of essays he wrote called The Two Treatises on Government, which came out in 1690 after the Glorious Revolution happened, 1688 in England. And what happened in England was, I'll get to it later, we talk about the British and all that, but King James II got overthrown by his own people because he was Catholic and I think, absolutist divine right. And so, if you know about John Locke was the political theorist that kind of pushed the idea that there ought to be like a social contract between the government and the people, like the ruler and the people, and all of that. He believed that the government was in charge of basically defending your three basic rights, which are life, liberty, and property. And he believed that if the government didn't do that, that they were justified in overthrowing them and putting in somebody that would. So that's he was kind of justifying, why James II got overthrown and he got replaced by William and Mary. We'll get to later at comment. So those are some ideas, of course, he talks about. Of course, the term social contract was invented by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who we've kind of already talked about already. But he heavily influenced like the Americans to kind of develop their own type of government over there. And the French Revolution and all that, and what happened over there in the French with their republics and all that later are kind of influenced by him. He also is the one who, another thing too about him, it's famous. Locke is also considered to be the so-called father of liberalism. I don't know if you know that or not as well. He also, that thing in there, it says in that little slide, he's the guy that kind of comes up with the idea of tabula rasa, clean slate. People are born with a clean slate, which kind of throws away that whole predestination ideas, I guess. He kind of pushed that idea, I guess, as well. So that's pretty much like most of the main famous people, I guess, that, existed, during the Enlightenment and all that. And let me go ahead and I need to also do a little review as well. So I'll go ahead and go with that because we'll talk about that. So let me go ahead and go through that real quick. So it says, what was the Age of Enlightenment, or also called Reason? That was a historical period, mostly in Europe and the Americas, where the society went through like a period of reform and changes brought on by the ideas of the Enlightenment, which were based off of reason, but also influenced heavily by the ideas of like the scientific revolution and even the Renaissance, heavily influenced it. Mostly took place in the 18th century, but they believe the Enlightenment started in the late 1600s and went up to like the time of Napoleon, like maybe close to the early 1800s, before like the Romanticism movement kind of took off later. What were some reforms, political changes that they wanted to do in the Enlightenment? Obviously, changes like political changes, like liberty, democracy, self-government, things like that, for examples. Give people equality, get rid of bigotry, have more toleration, ideas of progress. So these are all ideas that were put forth by the enlightened thinkers. They believe it was heavily influenced by the scientific revolution, especially the Copernican revolution that kind of started close to about the 16th, 17th centuries and all that. Who were examples of scientists that affected the later Enlightenment? The one that was the most famous was Sir Isaac Newton. Newton affected people the most, probably followed by Copernicus, Galileo. That was probably the big three that were influential. What did Copernicus discover about the solar system? What is the nickname of the modern model of the solar system that overturns the geocentric model? Copernicus figured out that the planets revolve around the sun, the so-called heliocentric model, or what they call the Copernican model. And this became part of the paradigm shift, scientific shift between, going from the heliocentric model to the geocentric model. And so that totally overturned everything, like in the world, like Europe and other places, and led to other scientific changes later, so-called Copernican revolution. So they call it heliocentric or Copernican. It's usually what they dub it. What laws did Kepler develop? The laws of planetary motion. Let's talk about how the planets go around the sun. Also, Kepler was the one that figured out that the planets revolve around the sun in like an ellipse instead of a complete circle, like a perfect circle, which is what Copernicus thought. What did Galileo get in trouble with the Catholic Church over? Of course, he got in trouble because Galileo was one of the first to support Galileo's theories, on the heliocentric model. Yeah, he wrote that book in 1632 called The Dialogue on the Two Chief World Systems. Got him a lot of hot water, and he was accused of heresy in front of a Catholic Inquisition. So it later led to him being put under house arrest and all that. Also, Galileo was known for experimenting with like objects. They call it the law of falling bodies, or studies with inertia to discover why bodies accelerate in space. And Galileo kind of discovered gravity originally, but didn't really know what it was until Newton kind of course, published his stuff. Why was Sir Francis Bacon important? Bacon was the one that helped popularize the scientific method, which originally was called the Baconian method. And he also was one of the two guys, him and Michel de Montaigne, if you know about it, was the other guy in France that helped develop the literary essay as well. Sir Isaac Newton, of course, was famous for being one of the major fathers of modern science, especially physics. He also helped develop like mathematics, like calculus, that everybody hates as well. He's also known for his famous book, which is the Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, or also called the Principia, was what they usually call it for short, the Principia. And that particular book is very famous because it has its famous laws of motion in it that we talked about. Hold on a second. And then also it has, of course, his theories on gravity or universal gravitation as well in it. Who are the philosophers? That's another question in there. Philosophers were the enlightened thinkers or scholars that were part of the Enlightenment. Most of them lived around the 18th century. Most of them were French. Some were not, like English, like John Locke, in England. I told you about. I also told you about Adam Smith's Scotland, Ben Franklin, also Thomas Jefferson in America. So those are some of them were like not French. Voltaire, of course, the most famous you may have heard of. Of course, the word philosophe meant philosopher, but they weren't really philosophers. They were more like just intellectuals that tried to push different new reform ideas. What were some of the main ideas, like the 5 main ideas that dominated the Enlightenment? The reason was the main one. Reason was the most famous of the 5. Also, I told you about nature, happiness, progress was another one. And of course, the one that was more controversial later, of course, the ideas of liberty, which later led to democracy, etc. So there's some of those different ideas, but reason's the one that they always talk about, and why they call it, what they call the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason overall. Who was Voltaire? Why was he important to the Enlightenment? Voltaire was the central figure of the Enlightenment. He was the biggest champion of like their causes. He even tried to help people as a lawyer. He was, of course, very famous as a writer, writing plays, essays, poetry, history, and other novels, and etc. And he was famous for a quote he would sometimes write to people in letters, which was "Crush the infamous thing." Forget how many letters he wrote, but he wrote like some crazy amount, like 30, 40,000 letters or more to people, like all over Europe. And even wrote to, like I told you, like different monarchs, like Catherine the Great and Frederick the Great. He's famous for several works. Oedipus, of course, was his famous play. It might have been his best work, he thought. Oedipus, which was a reworking of Oedipus Rex, Sophocles, like a French version of it. Of course, I'll tell you about he wrote this series of essays on England, how he praised England, Letters on the English, it was called. And then, of course, he became famous for the modern times now. Everybody thinks about his, satirical novel that he wrote that's called Candide, that some of you may have read. What work did Denis Diderot help develop and edit as a philosopher, a philosopher? That, of course, was the French Encyclopedia that I told you about, which was a precursor to other similar type mass dictionaries, which is what it was. The French Encyclopedia was basically this vehicle that philosophers used to publish their work, because a lot of places were closed to them because a lot of these new ideas were banned by people. So the French Encyclopedia led to like other versions, like Encyclopedia Britannica, which is probably the most famous one that's still around today. And now you got Wikipedia, of course, which is kind of like a version of that, but it's on the internet. What was Montesquieu famous for as a writer? Baron de Montesquieu was a French political writer, mostly wrote about government. He also was a historian. I think he was a lawyer. And Montesquieu was famous for his book he published, which is called The Spirit of the Laws. This particular book was very instrumental because it popularized new ideas in government. Montesquieu, I told you, believed that basically that he said to have good government, you need a state where the government's branches, which are, branches of government, which are legislative, judicial, and executive, need to be separate from each other. So he talks about the idea of separation of powers, which John Locke also talked about too. He also said they need to be a checks and balance system between the two, where each one would check each other, which I've talked about before. So Montesquieu was instrumental in that, in talking about that. And it influenced like the United States, and the United States' Constitution. Montesquieu was kind of considered like it's one of its fathers, at least the intellectual one. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, of course, he was a Swiss-French philosopher and writer who came to France from Switzerland. He mostly wrote about political ideas, like political liberties, and his big book he wrote about, of course, was The Social Contract. And The Social Contract was an important work which championed the idea of people having self-government. Rousseau, and along with Locke and a few others, were some of the first to discredit the idea of divine right and absolutism. And he believed that the people should have a say. We, the people, the general will, should have a say in creating their own self-government, and not the king deciding what's going to happen. He was famous, of course, Rousseau, for his quote, which is, I think I told you this before, but yet man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains. So he was talking about the idea that basically everybody's born with certain natural rights, which are, being free and all that. But you have all these tyrannical governments that are preventing you from really having these freedoms, despotic rulers, etc., because of absolutism. So that's why Rousseau wants people to have self-government and all that. Then we talked about Adam Smith. Adam Smith's important because he's kind of seen as the father of free trade, which will later lead to like capitalism, free enterprise. And of course, Smith was the one who wrote the book I just told you about, which is called The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776. So it's very important work. And Smith believed that there were three laws of economics, natural laws anyway, that should influence free trade, later capitalism. And I told you what they were: law of self-interest, law of competition, and law of supply and demand, are the three. Laissez-faire, I told you about that earlier, but laissez-faire was a French idea that was developed originally by the physiocrats. These were these economists in France. And they believed that to have free trade, one of the key ingredients in it is where the government doesn't overregulate the economy. They let it be or let it do, basically, and that will lead to better trade between countries and trade itself. And that's something that like Britain wasn't doing at the time, and that's why Smith kind of came up with that idea. I talked about John Locke on the bottom there. John Locke, of course, I told you, is an English philosopher, political theorist. And Locke, of course, was the one that advocated the idea that he talked about the idea of social contract, where there's a social contract between the ruler and the people, and that the government should be there to protect people's, rights. And if they, like, which I told you were the three things, the most important ones were, of course, life, liberty, and property were the, of course, main things that we had talked about. And he said that if the ruler can't do that, that they had a right to replace them, even violently possible, they could do that. Of course, his famous work that he published on this, which helped discredit divine right theory, was, of course, his work, Two Treatises on Government, that I've talked about, which heavily influenced, like, America. They read that. And so those ideas were ideas that they put into the U.S. Constitution, not just Montesquieu's ideas and other people. So that's enough information, on that period, kind of reviewing about that. I'm going to, of course, move on to talk about next. Of course, we're going to get into like the early history of like modern England today. Now, of course, talk about how, it's going to develop into the British Empire, over time, which will take a couple centuries. So I've got some time to kind of start on that. I don't know if I'll get too far on that today, but I will go ahead and start on that today. Of course, we will start first talking about the Tudor Dynasty, which you, of course, have probably heard of, which is very famous. And of course, Tudor Dynasty ruled over the Kingdom of England from 1485 to 1603. England came out of a civil war. I don't know if you know much about this. We don't usually cover too much in this class about it, but they had this civil war called the War of the Roses, where they had these two rival families, English families. They were called the Lancasters, and they had the Yorks. And they fought each other, and it was called the War of the Roses because they had a coat of arms, each of them. The Yorks had a white rose in their coat of arms, and the Lancasters had a red rose in their coat of arms, and so that's why they call it that. It dragged on for like 30 years, forever. This actual Civil War, and one of the guys that came out of on top was Henry Tudor. He basically seized power, 1485. They called him Henry VII, anyway. he goes on to found this dynasty. And the dynasty, like I said, will last over 100 years. It's like 118 years, 1485 to 1603. So that's basically what the Tudor dynasty was and all of that. And of course, I'll get into talking about some of the major rulers that were, of course, part of the Tudor dynasty today. Of course, mostly we'll probably have time to talk about Henry VIII. You see there was one of the most famous male rulers of the Tudor dynasty. Let me quick go through, though, before I do that, talk about the ones that were famous, because, there were, a bunch of these rulers that were part of the dynasty that were very famous that we're looking at right there. So yeah, that's actually all the rulers. They only had 5 rulers that were part of the Tudor dynasty. You have Henry VII, that told you, the founder, ruled 1485, 1509. Henry VIII ruled from 1509 to 1547. Edward VI, who's the son of Henry VIII, ruled 1547 to 1553. Then Mary I, you might know her as Mary Tudor, or of course very famously as Bloody Mary, right? 1553 to 58. And of course, Elizabeth I, so-called Virgin Queen, ruled from 1558 to 1603. She might be considered, of course, one of the most famous monarchs of British history overall. So, Now, let's first talk about Henry VIII a little bit. Now, of course, what Henry VIII is famous for, everybody's heard about this. Of course, we've talked about before, previously in other lectures, is that, he was famous for starting the whole English Reformation, which started in the 1530s in England. And I think I already told you this already before, but he started the church, this Anglican church, Church of England, because he wanted to annul his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon. That was his first wife. And of course, he's famous for his 6 wives of Henry VIII. And his first wife, a little about her, Catherine of Aragon. She was a Spanish princess. She was actually the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. Yeah. Anyway, she had originally married Henry's brother. His name was Arthur. What happened was Arthur died right before Henry became king. In fact, Arthur was supposed to be king, not him. And because he basically died, Henry became the ruler instead. And what Henry decided to do, if you know about it, he decided to marry his brother's wife. Part of this was political because he wanted to keep peace with the Spanish. They had kind of an alliance going at the time. And so that's why he married her. However, the only problem with Catherine of Aragon was that she only gave really Henry one legitimate heir, which was a daughter named Mary I, later known as Bloody Mary. He had other kids, but they all died. So then she couldn't have any more children. That was kind of concerning to Henry. He was kind of worried if they could really have a female ruler or not, because they hadn't really had any before in England. And so basically that's what led to him eventually forming the church, which was done through Parliament. Parliament passed a bunch of acts that created the church, which one of the main acts they passed, which was very important, was the Act of Supremacy, passed by Parliament 1534. What that did was it basically made Henry VIII the head of the church and state. So he was head of the state, like England, King of England. And then he was also the head of this new church that he created, Anglican Church or Church of England. And he became known as the so-called Supreme Head, that they called it. That's his title that he went by. And Henry quickly, as soon as he did that, if you know about it, he took over all the church's lands, all their buildings. He closed down their monasteries, closed down the convents, pretty much took all their money. He forced all the clergy that were under the Catholic Church to take basically an oath to him. A lot of them did. One of them didn't, if you know about this. Sir Thomas More refused to do it. He was executed for it. And I'll get to it later, but they'll have like various archbishops, which will become powerful under this new Anglican Church, which will be the archbishops of York and Canterbury, which Canterbury was more powerful, the one that's kind of seen as the most important one. So that's what Henry did. And in this church, this Anglican church he created was like really a quasi-Catholic church with him in power. Henry, it was like, I think they call it Henrician Catholicism is what they usually dub it. It's not really Protestant, a church yet. It will be later, but starts out as like a Catholic version with him in charge overall. So but he forms this new church, and that enables him to annul, his first marriage there. So he's able to marry again. So he marries a second wife, Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was the sister of another woman named Mary Boleyn, who was actually his mistress. She was an English noblewoman, and he wanted to have Anne Boleyn as his mistress too, but she wouldn't do that. So he went ahead and married her, and they would end up having one daughter together, which was later Elizabeth I, or the Virgin Queen. He was very disappointed that it wasn't a son that was born and all that. And so within like a couple years after he married her, I think she had some failed pregnancies after that. And so he got disgruntled about her, about whether she was going to be able to give him a male heir. And so he accused her of like treason against him in the Kingdom of England. And he brought her up on charge of treason, witchcraft. I think he accused her of witchcraft, and I think incest with one of her brothers, which I don't think that's true. And he had her executed. So he had her head cut off, basically, and got rid of her. So he didn't even have to annul that one. And so then he married again. So he had a third wife, which is Jane Seymour. Married her. And Jane Seymour, who was she? She was like a lady in waiting to Anne Boleyn, and basically became lovers with her. And Jane Seymour, if you know about it, became one of Henry's favorites. That was his favorite wife. That's the one he's buried next to Westminster Abbey. And she would give him one son, of course, which was Edward VI. But that marriage didn't last long because she died from complications from the childbirth. And so she died right afterwards. And so Henry was basically now out of 3 wives. But he had his male heir now. He got that, So, but he did get that out of that. Now, he did have 3 more. So I told you, Henry's known for his so-called 6 wives of Henry VIII, as they kind of nickname it. Those are the other 3 wives that he had as well. They had Anne of Cleves. And Cleves was this German princess that he decided to marry. He decided to marry some kind of foreign princess in Germany to kind of form an alliance with one of the German states over there. And they exchanged poitras, which was common in those days, and corresponded with each other. It's kind of like online dating back in the old days. Anyway, she came to England, and apparently felt like he was catfished or whatever with this relationship, and didn't like her, never consummated the whole thing. And so he pretty much annulled that one. It only lasted a short time, a month or so, or one of the shortest of the marriages he had overall. So he got rid of her. Then the 4th wife, of course, he went to Catherine Howard, very young teenager he married. And of course, however, he didn't understand that Catherine Howard had other men on the side. In fact, there was this guy named Henry Culpeper, was a lover of hers, who was actually a friend of Henry's. I find this out later, apparently, from some letters they wrote to each other. So she was accused of treason, because of committing adultery. And so he had her killed too, executed. So the only 2 wives that were executed by Henry were Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. So they were both killed. Then the last one is Catherine Parr, of course, sixth wife. And Catherine Parr was a divorcee. She had been married 2 times before. So it was a perfect match, these 2 divorcees together. But none of the last 3 gave him any children and all that. So he was kind of disappointed about that. But his later years, he got kind of disgusting, really fat. And I think one of his legs had gangrene or something like that. He either died of that, or some people think he may have died of syphilis. It's been debated about that because he had so many women and mistresses and all that. Who knows what he contracted, from that. Now he died in 1547, January 1547. So he left the throne to his son, Edward VI. And of course, we're going to, talk a little bit about Edward today. I think I've maybe got some stuff. I do have I think I've got a slide here showing some of the other rulers that I've got here. There's the Tudor family, and you can see Edward right here, related to Jane Seymour. I've got another picture. Here's some other pictures you want to look at later of all the 4 wives. Which one was the prettiest? That's been kind of debated about that. I don't know. Man, I know I heard that Catherine Howard was pretty good looking, but I'm not sure about which one. Anyway, but there's Edward on the left. He didn't reign long. He only reigned about 6 years, Edward. I don't know if you know much about Edward, but Edward was a very sickly ruler. He had apparently contracted tuberculosis during his reign. They call it consumption in the old days because it would consume your lungs over time and kill you. Under him, what happened was Protestantism started to filter up into the country of England from basically, I think from like a combination of like from Scotland and also from the continent of Europe. And what happened was over time, he would allow Protestant ideas, Protestant prayer books, and then he even kind of pretty much converted to Protestantism. So they usually consider him to be, like I said, the first Protestant ruler that they actually have overall. And under him, very importantly, one big thing that happened, to just mention a little bit about, was that the Archbishop of Canterbury, his name was Thomas Cranmer, he's one that, of course, completed the famous Book of Common Prayer. This became the main prayer book of the Anglican Church, which is still used today, like various editions of it. And usually, I think they kind of call it for short BCP or something like that. And so that was something they started doing. Also, like all the sermons, like all the church services, were all in English. They began having English Bibles, which Henry VIII started producing at the time. So all this is kind of starting to convert more to English from, say, doing things in Latin like they're still doing in Europe, like with the Catholic Church. But he wasn't in power very long. Like I said, 6 years. I don't know if you've read that book by Mark Twain. The famous novelist Mark Twain. Samuel Clemens had a book about him. You may have heard of, called The Prince and the Pauper. It's kind of about that same period. They made movies about Edward VI. And he may have been a great king, if he would have lived long. But he died maybe around 15. So he was a teenager when he died. So he was very, very young. So who knows what would happen if he would have ruled. Now, after he died, controversy ensued, if you know about this. He died about, I don't think when it was. I think it was July 1553 is about right. And he had this cousin named Lady Jane Grey. And he wanted to give the throne to her because she was Protestant. He didn't want to give it to his half-sister, who was really next in line, which is Mary, Bloody Mary later, as they call her, Mary the First, because she was Catholic. So I think it's July the 10th, I want to say, is the date. Around July 10th, yeah. They think that Lady Jane Grey then tried to seize power and take the throne but she only lasted about 9 days. And because of that, her sister, half sister, came in, which is Mary the First. Later, she deposed her throne, and eventually that led to her being nicknamed later, you know, the 9 Days Queen, and all that. Now, anyway, so yeah, the 9 Days Queen is what they called her. So she's deposed 1553. I'll get to it later. She's later executed. If you know about it, they cut her head off, or Mary does anyway. So yeah, Mary will come in next, and yeah, Mary was very unpopular. They still hate her. I think her and I think they still hate her over there in Britain. They call her Bloody Mary, you know, that kind of thing, and very unpopular ruler. A lot of it, of course, had to do with the fact that she was, of course, involved in this Counter-Reformation, which she started in 1553 when she seized power from Lady Jane Grey, and she wanted to reconvert England back to being Catholic, because, you know, basically under what is under Henry VIII and, you know, Edward, they started, of course, going more towards being Protestant at the time. And so she started this persecution towards Protestants, which that's how she got her name, the sobriquet, or, you know, nickname, Bloody Mary. And she imprisoned a lot of Protestants. She wasn't quite 300, but I think close to maybe 280 Protestants were actually burned at the stake. They were still burning people at the stake at that time. This is in the, you know, 16th century we're talking about here. And one of the men that he had burned at the stake was Thomas Cranmer. Remember, the Archbishop of Canterbury basically got him and had him killed under her. And so she literally came in, shut down the Anglican Church, and brought in the Catholic Church and tried to kind of reboot it. That's what she was trying to do. Then she married this Prince of Spain. That was really unpopular as well in 1554, which is, of course, Philip, the Prince of Spain. He was the crown prince. And if you know about him, he was the son of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. He was also King Charles I, or Carlos I of Spain. He was still the ruler in Europe at the time. He hadn't retired yet, stepped down. And really unpopular. Some of the nobility in England didn't really want to do that anymore because a lot of people were going Protestant. And of course, the Spanish were Catholic. They thought that would open up a can of worms. And what happened was in 1554, the beginning of 54, it led to the rebellion in the country, where some nobility rebelled against Mary's government. And of course, the most famous, of course, was Wyatts Rebellion, which broke out in the southeastern part of England, an area called Kent. And Sir Thomas Wyatt was actually, believe it or not, he was a distant cousin to Queen Elizabeth later. They were related. Some people think there maybe somehow, I don't know if she was involved in that or not. There's been some debate about that. Maybe she backed the guy or not. I know they'd helped each other out before. And anyway, he got together a force of something like 3,000 to 4,000 men at one point. They marched on London. They almost got to like where the London Bridge was. And Mary's forces came out and eventually put it down. And Wyatt and about almost 100 men were eventually arrested, I know, for it. And they were executed for being behind this rebellion against her. So she was really unpopular, Mary. And of course, continued throughout her reign. Nobody really liked her and all of that. And they were kind of worried her husband would take over, would take over the throne and all that. Philip, who later became Philip II of Spain, the King of Spain. Also, there was this thing throughout her whole reign where they kept saying she was pregnant. the so-called phantom pregnancy of Mary I. What they found out later, of course, afterwards, was that she was not pregnant and that she had a tumor in her womb. Had cancer, like uterine cancer, I think is what it was. And she ended up, that's what ended up causing her to die. And so Mary would end up dying. She didn't have any children. And so the throne then went to, of course, her half sister, who would come in next, who everybody's heard of, which, of course, is Queen Elizabeth I, who, of course, I'm going to talk about next today, right here. Of course, she's the last of the Tudor monarchs that'll come in power. Of course, fourth longest reigning overall. Did she reign close to 45 years? That's how long she reigned overall. And she is known by different nicknames. You see that. Of course, her most common name she's called, of course, is the so-called Virgin Queen. She's called this, of course, because of the fact that, first of all, she never married. She was on the throne by herself as sole ruler without a consort. And then she also, they say she never may have had sex. I don't know if that's really true or not. Some say, I don't know. Some people think she may have had lovers on the side, like Sir Robert Dudley, I think was maybe her favorite possible with that. But that's never really ever been proven, believe it or not, about that. She was called Good Queen Bess. However, she could be also Bad Queen Bess, because she put to death a lot of people too under her reign. So she was pretty bad too. She may have been bloodier than Mary was before that. Gloriana, that was another nickname that she was also called. So yeah, she came into the throne very young. She was only 25 years old. She had kind of been a survivor. You know, her half sister could have had her killed. I don't know why she didn't, but she didn't. And so she was able to survive and take power. And the period of her reign is often called different nicknames. Elizabethan Era, the Shakespearean Era. They call it the Golden Age of England. You've probably heard of that. Those are all nicknames that they kind of call her period when she's in power. It's almost like the beginning of the whole British Empire. It's really starting here right now, because England even tries to colonize, which they weren't successful with initially, but they will starting right after she dies overall. Now, one big thing that she inherited, which was a big problem during her reign, was dealing with what to do with the Anglican Church, because, you know, they had the Catholic Church was brought back in by Mary I at one point. And so she starts a bunch of reforms that they call the Elizabethan religious settlement, which was done between 1558 59 with Parliament. Parliament passed a bunch of acts which basically did this. And it did several things. It restored the Anglican Church, Church of England. It also made reforms and changes to the church. Some of these changes were also made to maybe allow not just Protestants, but Catholics to want to join it and all that. Yes, it was mostly a Protestant church, especially based on like Calvinistic ideas, which are kind of in the like Book of Common Prayer and all that. But it did keep some Catholic ideas. Like they kept clergy, you know, like bishops and priests, like the so-called episcopacy, they called it, and all that. And they had two chief bishops, I told you, which were very important clerical officials, very big, which are, of course, Archbishop of Canterbury, which is the highest one, and then York, of course, was the other one. That's also very important. Here's some other slides too, which are important too as well. One thing that's different about the Anglican Church in comparison with the Catholic Church, they allow the priest to marry. So priests can marry within the Anglican Church. You know, it's something in the Catholic Church that they kind of forbid. You got to be celibate and all that. They do now allow women to be ordained. That's something that they do, of course, in the Anglican Church, which the Catholic Church, of course, does none of those as well. Of course, like it says on the bottom, all the church services, sermons, prayer books, Bibles, and everything are all written in English, pretty much. Okay. So anyway, other things too she did too. She passed this act through Parliament, which is called the Act of Uniformity. You may have heard of it in 1559. What it did was it reestablished the use of the Book of Common Prayer, brought it back, which I think they may have revised it again. Anyway, that was the main thing that was in it. And then, so it basically made all churches within all of England use this prayer book. They had to use it in English. And then other thing it did too, the Act of Uniformity, it forced everybody to attend that church. So there was no other church to go to. You couldn't go to a Catholic church or some other church that might exist. If you didn't go to church, you could be fined, maybe even imprisoned. So there was no religious freedom in Elizabethan England, that kind of deal. Later, that's why people leave, like go to America, other places, because they're persecuted and all that, and can't go to their church or whatever. And so that's why that happened. Also, another thing that Parliament passed, this is all part of the English Elizabethan religious settlement, of course, is the Act of Supremacy, 1559. What that did was it basically made again the monarch the head of the church and state, just like it was under Henry VIII and Edward, and except they changed the title. It used to be Supreme Head. It's now Supreme Governor, and now it still is today, under like Elizabeth II now. So kind of talking about Elizabeth, in her reign and all of that. Let me talk about, I think I've got time for maybe, I don't know if I have time for one more event or not. I was going to talk about something else. I might talk about one more thing on this slide, and that's probably it real quick here, but let me do it for a few minutes on that. Elizabeth also had this cousin of hers I need to talk about, which is Mary, Queen of Scots. You may have heard of her. Mary, Queen of Scots was the closest heir to Queen Elizabeth. First cousin, lived in Scotland. She was the ruler of Scotland from 1547 to 1567. Elizabeth never had any children, which was a major problem, thorn in her side in the whole time she was in power. Mary, Queen of Scots was kind of controversial. She was a very beautiful woman, by the way, they say. Even paintings of her, she looks very pretty. But she was not a successful ruler. Had a lot of problems during her reign. And she was married multiple times, kind of like Henry VIII was. I think there's even some speculation she may have murdered one of her husbands, maybe even another one as well. I think there's the theory that maybe she may have murdered her first husband, Francis II. I don't know if that's true or not. Anyway, when she was married 3 times, Francis II, who was the ruler of France at one point, and then she also married these 2 Scottish lords, Lord Darnley, Henry Stuart, who's related to the Tudor Dynasty in Scotland, and then the Earl of Bothwell, James Hepburn, also married him at one point. Well, anyway, what happened was her second husband, Henry Stuart, he was a drunk, totally just a drunk, and just couldn't rule anything. And so she was pretty much the one that was ruling the whole country. And anyway, she had this other guy named the Earl of Bothwell, named James Hepburn. He really liked Mary Stuart, wanted to marry her, but she had a husband. And so they think what happened was Hepburn killed Stuart, murdered him, basically. There's, of course, big scandal about it because many think that maybe Mary Stuart may have been somehow involved with that murder of Henry Stuart, somehow involved in it. And so she was later imprisoned. And I'll get more into it later, but in Scotland, they had Presbyterianism was starting to take off at the time. And so having a Catholic ruler on the throne wasn't really a big popular thing. And so one of her jailers let her go, I guess because she felt sorry for her or whatever. And so what happened was Mary Stuart then fled to England, thinking that her cousin Elizabeth would help her get her throne back and all that. And what Elizabeth did instead was he imprisoned her for almost 20 years, like 19, 20 years in England, because she didn't want to put a Catholic ruler back on the throne of Scotland, you know, because she would rather have like a Protestant ruler, because after Mary Stuart fled Scotland, she had a son named James VI, who I'll get to later, became king. He was a Protestant ruler in Scotland. What happened to poor Mary, if you know about it, she later got involved in some kind of failed plot to overthrow her cousin Elizabeth. It was called Babington Plot, which they're not sure if it was even a real plot or not. It was uncovered by one of Elizabeth's famous spy masters named Francis Walsingham, you may have heard of. And anyway, they found out about this. Of course, this is treason, you know, against her cousin Elizabeth, and she was put on trial for it in 1587, and then she was executed for it. So with that execution, I'll get more into it later, but, you know, that's going to eventually lead into James VI of Scotland becoming the King of England, later called James I, you know of, and I'll get more into that later after Elizabeth dies. But anyway, I think that's pretty much it right now for talking about Elizabethan England and, of course, the Tudor Dynasty. I'm gonna come back, of course, later and talk about more into our early modern England on Thursday's class. I'll finish up talking about the Tudor Dynasty, and then I'll move on to talk about the Stuart Dynasty that follows. If I have any time, I'll also talk about some of the other dynasties that were in British history that were later as well. Before we go, I do want to remind you about some things. Let's see here. Of course, don't forget about your online first exam. That's, of course, due coming up. I have moved it back. I don't know if you've seen that or not, but I have moved it back a couple days. Today is September 29th, so it is now going to be due on October 1st, which is a Thursday. So you do have 2 days to kind of wrap it up because a few of you, I think, are behind trying to finish it up. But you need to try to get that done because I am going to be having a new Canvas quiz coming up, of course, which is on this period of the Age of Enlightenment that's behind me. And then I'll talk more about also like wrapping that up England on Thursday and also next week. I don't think we'll get to finish England probably till, I want to say, Tuesday overall. But also there's a Canvas quiz that's been posted. You've probably seen that too, which is a video quiz. So that's something to also don't forget about as well. Let me share that with you real quick so you don't, forget about it. But let me see if I can find it. Let's see. I think I had it up here. But yeah, you got that announcement right there. You have. And then if you go to announcements, there should be the other one. I thought I put an announcement about it, I believe. Yeah, there it is right there. But yeah, don't forget about that one too. I think y'all have already seen it before, but I have been sending out reminders about trying to complete that one. I'll probably move it back a couple days, I know, like I always do, but try to get that done. I'll keep sending reminders out to you about it. So anyway, that's it for today. If anybody else has any questions, let me know. I don't think anybody sent me anything question-wise about this lecture. But later I am going to upload this video later. Yeah, I'll put it up later on my YouTube channel. This is temporary, the link I'll send you with Facebook Live. But just send me any kind of comments, questions you have about this lecture overall, and let me know how you felt about it. Also, you remember you get bonus points for sending me like questions and stuff like that overall. So that's it for today. I hope y'all are doing okay out there, safe and all that. And I will have another lecture on Thursday wrapping up more on talking about, early modern England. So that's about it for today. So y'all take care, and I'll see I guess whoever's on here on Thursday. So take care.